The stone is warm, even in shadow. It is a spring afternoon in 1947, and the Judean desert lies still, the way it has lain still for thousands of years. No wind moves through the limestone hills. No birds call. Only the faint clatter of a goat's hooves on rock breaks the silence. Somewhere below, along the dry slopes that fall toward the Dead Sea, a boy named Muhammad Ed-Dib is climbing after that goat. He is a Bedouin shepherd, perhaps 15 years old, though no one recorded his exact age, and no one thought, in that moment, that it mattered. He is annoyed. The goat has wandered from the herd again, slipping between boulders, vanishing into one of the countless clefts that mark this stretch of cliffside, near a ruin the local people call Qumran. He picks up a stone. He means only to toss it into a hole in the rock, to startle the animal out. He hears something else instead. Not a bleat, not hooves scrambling on stone. A sound duller and stranger, the sound of something breaking. Pottery, perhaps. He does not go in right away. It is getting dark, and the desert at dusk is not a place for lingering curiosity. He returns to his camp. He tells no one anything urgent. It is, after all, just a hole in a cliff. Here is the strange thing about this story. Nothing about that afternoon looked historic. There was no ceremony, no scholar present, no sense in the boy's mind that he stood at the edge of one of the great archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. He was thinking about a lost goat. That is all. It would be a few days before he, or a cousin who came with him, returned to the cave with more curiosity than fear. They lowered themselves into the opening. Inside, the air was cool and close, and dust hung motionless in the thin light. Along the floor and against the walls stood tall clay jars, cylindrical, sealed with lids, some broken, some intact. It must have looked, at first, like the kind of place where a family might store grain, or oil, or water against a long journey. But grain does not smell like old leather, and oil does not crackle like dry parchment. Inside several of the jars were bundles wrapped in cloth, brittle with age, blackened in places, the linen disintegrating at the edges. Beneath the cloth, scrolls, rolled sheets of animal skin and papyrus, covered edge to edge in careful, ancient handwriting, a script neither boy could read. They did not know what they had found. How could they understand what the desert around them concealed? To their eyes, these might have been worthless, old skins, cracked and curling, worth perhaps a few coins if a merchant in Bethlehem was feeling generous. They took several scrolls back with them, treating them, for a while, the way one treats any old thing whose value has not yet been proven. There are accounts, likely exaggerated in the retelling, but persistent nonetheless, of scrolls being handled roughly, of one perhaps used almost as a plaything before anyone grasped what lay in the ink. It would take time, precious, unhurried time, the way discoveries in that part of the world often unfold, before the scrolls pass from Bedouin hands into the hands of an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem named Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known to most as Kando. He recognized, better than the shepherds had, that something about these objects was unusual. He began to make inquiries. Word moved slowly, the way it did before instant news, passed between markets and monasteries and universities, a whisper traveling from the desert toward the scholars of Jerusalem. None of them yet understood the scale of what had happened. They did not know that this cave, later numbered, prosaically, Cave 1, was only the beginning. That 10 more caves along these same cliffs would eventually yield their own troves. That within these fragile skins lay copies of biblical texts 1,000 years older than any previously known. That the words preserved in that jar had waited, in darkness and silence, through the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, through the birth of Christianity, through the spread of Islam, through crusades and empires and revolutions. Waited, without a single reader, for nearly 2,000 years. A boy chasing a goat had reached backward through time and touched the ancient world with his own hand. To understand what he found and why it would come to matter so deeply to historians, theologians, and ordinary readers around the world, we have to leave this cave for a while. We have to go back, further than 1947, further than the Ottoman centuries, further than the Crusades, back to a much older desert and a much older kind of silence, where a small community of devoted men first began pressing ink into skin, page after page, in the shadow of an uncertain and dangerous world. 2,000 years before the shepherd boy climbed toward that cave, another young man walked this same stretch of wilderness, though we do not know his name. We know only that he, and others like him, chose this place on purpose. The Dead Sea sits at the lowest point on the surface of the earth, more than 400 meters below sea level. A basin of water so dense with salt that a person floats upon it without effort, unable to sink even if they tried. The air here is thick and mineral. The heat presses down like a hand. Almost nothing grows along its shores except a scattering of tamarisk and thorn. To the ancient world, this was not a place people chose to live. This was a place people fled to. And that, it seems, was exactly the point. Sometime in the 2nd century before the Common Era, a group of Jews began settling at a site along the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, a place the Arabic-speaking world would later call Qumran. They built modest structures from the pale local stone, a scriptorium, a dining hall, a network of cisterns to catch the rare desert rain. They dug ritual baths into the rock and used them often, sometimes several times a day. Cleanliness, for this community, was not incidental. It was central to who they believed themselves to be. Scholars still debate exactly who these people were. Most, though not all, connect them to a Jewish sect known as the Essenes, described by ancient writers such as the historian Josephus and the philosopher Philo of Alexandria. According to these accounts, the Essenes lived apart from mainstream Jewish society, held property in common, ate together in silence, and devoted themselves to strict interpretation of the law. Josephus wrote that they rose before dawn, spoke no idle word before their prayers, and worked in near silence through the heat of the day. Why would anyone choose this? Why leave the markets of Jerusalem, the noise of family, the comfort of a settled town, for a life of salt wind and rationed water? The answer lies in a quieter kind of catastrophe. Not a war, not a famine, but something more corrosive, the sense that the center could no longer be trusted. By this period, the temple in Jerusalem, the holiest site in Judaism, was under the control of a priesthood many devout Jews viewed as compromised. Political power had entangled itself with religious authority. The high priesthood, once passed down through careful lineage, had in some cases become a prize handed out by foreign-backed rulers, sold or awarded rather than earned. To a community that believed sacred law should never bend to political convenience, this was not a minor scandal. It was corruption at the very heart of their world. So they left. They did not leave in anger alone. They left with purpose. If Jerusalem's temple had strayed from purity, then purity would have to be preserved somewhere else, by someone else, until the corruption passed or the world itself was set right. This is the emotional engine at the center of the Qumran community. Not simple rejection, but devotion so severe it required exile. Life at Qumran was rigorous, almost beyond modern imagining. New members underwent a lengthy period of testing, sometimes lasting years, before being trusted with the community's full teachings and property. Speech was regulated. Interrupting another member during a formal meeting could result in public correction. Laughing inappropriately, according to surviving community rules, could mean a reduction in food rations for as long as 30 days. These were not idle threats. The rules were written down, preserved, copied, recopied. Some of these very rule scrolls would one day be found in the same caves as the biblical texts, giving later readers an almost uncomfortably intimate window into the discipline of daily life here. And yet this was not a joyless place, not entirely. There was structure, purpose, belonging. Meals were taken together, blessings spoken over bread and wine in a manner that would later echo, intriguingly, in early Christian practice. Members believed themselves to be living at the edge of history, awaiting a decisive moment. A final battle between the forces of light and darkness. A battle they described in detail in text that read almost like a soldier's field manual crossed with a hymn. They were waiting for the end of the world, or at least the end of the world they knew. And while they waited, they wrote. They copied scripture by hand, sheet after sheet, using ink made from soot and gum, pressed onto skins prepared with painstaking care. They copied their own community rules. They copied hymns, prophecies, calendars, calculations of sacred time down to the day. Some of what they wrote had never existed before. Original compositions born from their own theology, their own sense of chosen destiny. It is worth pausing here in the quiet of that scriptorium to imagine the sound of it. Reed pens scratching against parchment, the occasional cough, the low murmur of someone reciting a line aloud before committing it to skin. No one in that room believed they were writing for us. They believed they were writing for God, and perhaps for the small number of the faithful who would outlast the coming storm. They could not have known that the storm, when it finally came, would not be the apocalypse they expected. It would be something both smaller and larger. A single empire, methodical and merciless, marching down from the north. And at the center of that oncoming storm stood a man about whom we know a great deal, and yet frustratingly little. A figure the community itself called, simply, the teacher of righteousness. He is never named, not once, in any scroll recovered from those 11 caves. Does the man at the heart of the Qumran community's founding story appear under his own name? The texts call him only the teacher of righteousness, a title, not a name, deliberately withholding the one detail that might have let later generations locate him precisely in time. Whether this was intentional secrecy, reverence, or simply the custom of the age, no one can say for certain. What survives instead is something almost more intimate than a name. The shape of a grievance, preserved across 2,000 years in the handwriting of people who loved him. The clearest picture comes from a document scholars call the Habakkuk Commentary, one of the best preserved of all the scrolls, a line-by-line reinterpretation of an Old Testament prophetic book read through the lens of the community's own history. In it, the teacher of righteousness stands opposed to a figure called the wicked priest. Again, no proper name, only a title dripping with judgment. Picture the scene the text implies. A priest, likely one of the legitimate line, is passed over or displaced from the high priesthood in Jerusalem, a position he may have believed was his by right, by lineage, by training. Political currents beyond his control, the maneuverings of the Hasmonean dynasty, a family that had seized both political and religious power in Judea after a successful revolt against Greek rule a generation earlier. The ambitions of men with armies decide otherwise. Someone else, someone the teacher and his followers considered illegitimate, ascends to the highest religious office in the land. The teacher does not accept this quietly. The scrolls suggest a bitter falling out, a rupture severe enough to drive the teacher and a devoted core of followers out of Jerusalem entirely. There are hints of persecution, a pursuit into the wilderness, a confrontation on a sacred day, even language suggesting the wicked priest sought the teacher's life. One passage describes the wicked priest pursuing the teacher to his place of exile, intent on swallowing him up in his venomous anger. Vivid, personal language, the kind that does not come from abstract theological disagreement, but from something that felt, to the people writing it, like betrayal. Imagine, for a moment, what it must have meant to lose a fight like that. Not a battle of armies, but a battle of legitimacy. The sense of being cast out from your own home by people you once considered your community. Many movements in history, faced with this kind of humiliation, simply dissolve. Followers drift back to ordinary life. The grievance fades into private bitterness. This one did not dissolve. It hardened into purpose. The followers of the teacher did not merely retreat to lick their wounds. They reframed their exile as prophecy fulfilled. If the temple in Jerusalem had fallen into corrupt hands, then true worship had to continue elsewhere. among the faithful in a community that considered itself, quite literally, the true Israel in miniature, a walking, breathing substitute for the temple itself, its members functioning almost as priests even without an altar. This reframing explains so much of what the caves would later reveal. It explains the obsessive record-keeping, the strict calendars. The Qumran community even used a different calendar from the mainstream Jewish establishment, a solar calendar of 364 days rather than the lunar-based system used in Jerusalem, ensuring that their sacred festivals fell on entirely different days than everyone else's. Imagine the strangeness of that. An entire community celebrating its holiest days in isolation, unsynchronized from the rest of their own people. A calendar of defiance ticking along in the desert while Jerusalem observed its holidays on other dates entirely. It explains, too, the sense of cosmic urgency running through so many of the scrolls. If you believe the center of your religious world has been captured by corruption, you begin to see history itself as a battlefield. One of the most remarkable scrolls found in the caves, a lengthy text modern scholars call the War Scroll, describes in extraordinary tactical detail a future battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. Troop formations, trumpet signals, the precise wording of battle cries, the exact ages at which men would be called to fight. It reads, in places, like a military manual written for a war that had not yet happened, composed by people utterly convinced it would. We do not know exactly when the teacher of righteousness died. We do not know whether he saw his small desert community grow, or whether he died believing his life's mission had ended in failure. What we do know is that his followers kept faith with his memory in the most enduring way available to them. They kept writing, and it is to that act of writing, the daily, unglamorous, physical labor of turning animal skin into sacred memory, that we now must turn, because the scrolls themselves, the objects the shepherd boy would one day find, were not created easily, and the story of how they were made is almost as remarkable as the story of what they contain. Before a single word could be written, an animal had to die. This is not a grim detail included for shock. It is simply the truth of how sacred text was made in the ancient world, and understanding it changes how we should imagine those quiet rooms at Qumran. Most of the scrolls were written on parchment, prepared from the skins of sheep or goats, occasionally calves, animals that were, in this arid economy, valuable in their own right, kept for milk and wool and meat. To surrender a hide for writing was not a casual decision. It was an investment of real resources into the preservation of words. The process of turning skin into something fit to hold sacred text was slow, smelly, and exact. The hide first had to be soaked, often in a lime solution, to loosen the hair and outer layers. Then it was stretched, pulled taut across a wooden frame, and scraped repeatedly with a curved blade, removing flesh from one side and hair from the other, working the material thinner and thinner until it became something closer to a translucent sheet than an animal's covering. This scraping had to be done with enormous care. Too aggressive, and the blade would tear through, ruining the skin entirely. Too gentle, and the parchment would remain thick, stiff, unwilling to hold ink cleanly. Once scraped, the skin was left to dry under tension, still stretched on its frame, so that it would not shrink unevenly or curl. Only after drying was it rubbed smooth, sometimes with pumice, sometimes with a chalky substance to make the surface more receptive to ink. The finished product was pale, slightly translucent in places, and surprisingly durable. Durable enough, as it turned out, to survive 2,000 years in a sealed jar in the desert air. Some of the scrolls found at Qumran, though far fewer, were written instead on papyrus, a material made from the pressed pith of a reed plant grown along the Nile in Egypt, imported at real expense into a region where it did not grow naturally. And in at least one extraordinary case, the community wrote on a material almost no one expected: copper. The so-called copper scroll, found in Cave 3, is unlike anything else in the collection. a listing of hidden treasure, 64 locations of gold, silver, and sacred vessels, hammered rather than written, into thin sheets of metal later riveted together into a scroll too fragile and oxidized to simply unroll. When scholars finally opened it in the 1950s, they did not unroll it at all. They cut it carefully into strips at a laboratory in Manchester, England, because the metal had become too brittle to bend even slightly without shattering. But treasure maps were the exception. Most of what survived was scripture, hymn, and rule, and the ink used to write these ordinary miracles was itself a careful preparation, typically a mixture of soot, scraped from the bottom of oil lamps or gathered from burned resin, combined with water and a binding agent such as gum arabic, ground and mixed until it achieved a consistency that would flow evenly from a reed pen without blotting or fading. The pen itself was often nothing more than a hollow reed, cut at an angle, the tip split slightly to allow ink to draw down by capillary action, much like a fountain pen does today. A skilled scribe could produce lines of startling uniformity with such a simple tool. Evenly spaced, evenly weighted, letter after letter marching down the skin in disciplined rows. And the letters themselves followed rules nearly as strict as the community's dietary laws. Certain scribes at Qumran left the divine name of God, the 4 Hebrew letters transliterated as YHWH, written not in the same script as the surrounding text, but in an older, archaic Hebrew alphabet, a form of visual reverence, setting the name of God apart from ordinary language even within the same line, the same page, the same sentence. Imagine writing an entire paragraph in one alphabet, then switching mid-thought into a different and older set of letters, simply because certain words deserve to look different from all others. That is the kind of care we are talking about. Mistakes were not always erased. Sometimes a scribe would strike through an error with careful dots above the offending letters rather than scraping the skin clean, preserving evidence, unintentionally, for us, of a human hand behind the text, a small failure of concentration frozen in ink for 2,000 years. We can, if we look closely enough at these fragments today, sometimes see exactly where a tired scribe's attention wandered, late in a long day of work, the desert light fading outside the scriptorium window. Once completed, sheets of parchment were sewn together along their edges with linen thread, forming a single continuous scroll, sometimes remarkably long. The Great Isaiah Scroll, one of the best preserved documents ever found at Qumran, stretches to nearly 24 feet when fully unrolled, containing the entire text of the biblical book of Isaiah in 66 columns of neat, disciplined Hebrew script. All of this labor, all of this precision, existed for one purpose: to preserve words the community believed were eternal, in a world they were increasingly certain was ending. They had reason to believe so. Beyond the walls of their small desert settlement, beyond the salt flats and the cliffs, a much larger and more dangerous history was unfolding. One involving kingdoms, client rulers, and the slow, grinding approach of the most powerful military force in the ancient Mediterranean world. To understand why the Qumran community eventually hid their precious library in the caves rather than leaving it safely on a shelf, we need to step back from the scriptorium entirely and look at the wider, harsher world closing in around them. Judea, in the centuries surrounding the life of the teacher of righteousness, was never simply Judea's own. It was a small, fiercely contested territory caught between empires far larger than itself, a hinge of land connecting Africa to Asia, valuable not for its size, but for its position. Whoever controlled the roads through Judea controlled trade, controlled troop movement, controlled access to Egypt in one direction and Mesopotamia in the other. This meant that Judea rarely got to decide its own fate. Larger powers decided it instead, and the region's history through this period reads like a long list of new masters arriving to replace the old. First came the Greeks, following the conquest of Alexander the Great, whose empire fractured after his death into rival successor kingdoms, one of which, the Seleucid Empire, eventually came to dominate Judea. Greek rule brought Greek customs, Greek language, Greek gymnasiums built uncomfortably close to the Jewish temple, and, under one particularly aggressive ruler named Antiochus IV, an attempt to forcibly suppress Jewish religious practice altogether. Circumcision was banned. Copies of the Torah were ordered destroyed. A statue, possibly of Zeus, was erected within the temple itself, and pigs, an animal considered ritually impure, were reportedly sacrificed upon its altar. This is the kind of detail easy to state flatly and easy to underestimate. Picture what it meant to a devout family in Jerusalem. The holiest site in their entire religious universe, defiled deliberately by decree as an act of political theater. It is not surprising that this desecration provoked rebellion. A priestly family known as the Hasmoneans, led initially by a man named Mattathias, and then by his son Judah, who earned the nickname Maccabee, meaning roughly the hammer, rose in armed revolt against Greek rule. Against long odds, they won. The revolt succeeded. The temple was purified and rededicated, an event still celebrated today as Hanukkah. And for a brief, remarkable period, Judea became independent, ruled by the very Hasmonean family that had led the rebellion. But independence did not bring the peace many had hoped for. It brought something more complicated, a Hasmonean dynasty that combined political and religious power in a single ruling family, in a way many devout Jews found troubling. Some Hasmonean rulers took not only the title of king, but also the office of high priest, concentrating both political and religious authority into hands many believe should remain separate. It is precisely this concentration of power, this blending of ambition and sacred office, that many scholars believe lies behind the anger recorded in the Qumran scrolls, the specific grievance of the teacher of righteousness against the so-called wicked priest. And even this troubled independence did not last. By the middle of the 1st century before the Common Era, a new power had begun extending its reach across the entire Mediterranean world, absorbing kingdom after kingdom with methodical, almost bureaucratic efficiency: Rome. In 63 BCE, a Roman general named Pompey marched into Jerusalem, intervened in a Hasmonean succession dispute, and effectively ended Judean independence, though local rulers continued to govern, now firmly under Roman oversight. The most famous or infamous of these Roman-backed rulers was a man named Herod, later remembered by history as Herod the Great, a title that reflects his extraordinary building projects far more than any personal virtue. Herod expanded the temple in Jerusalem into one of the architectural wonders of the ancient world, its retaining walls built from stones so massive that some weighed over 300 tons, quarried and placed with a precision that still impresses engineers today. And yet, this was the same Herod remembered in historical and religious tradition for ruthless suppression of any perceived threat to his rule, including, according to some accounts, members of his own family. It was into this unstable, glittering, dangerous world that the Qumran community continued its quiet existence in the desert. Small, disciplined, convinced of its own righteousness, watching a much larger drama unfold from a careful distance. From their cliffside settlement, they would have seen little of Herod's construction projects directly, but they would have felt the ripple effects. Taxation, shifting political alliances, the constant undercurrent of unrest that comes from a proud people governed, ultimately, by a foreign power they had not chosen. Rome, for its part, tolerated a great deal in its provinces, so long as taxes were paid and order maintained. But tolerance has limits, and Judea, more than almost any other Roman province, kept testing those limits. Religious sensitivities ran deep. Resentment simmered beneath the surface of daily life, occasionally boiling over into open unrest, quickly and often brutally suppressed. The Qumran community, watching all of this from their desert vantage point, seemed to have read these tensions not as ordinary political friction, but as confirmation of their deepest beliefs, that the world was corrupt that a final reckoning was approaching, that the forces of light and darkness were indeed gathering for the confrontation described so vividly in their own war scroll. They were not entirely wrong that a reckoning was coming. They simply misjudged its shape, its timing, and its survivors. For now, though, in this uneasy calm before the storm, the community continued its extraordinary work of preservation, filling jar after jar with the accumulated wisdom, law, and hope of their tradition. It is worth pausing before the storm finally breaks upon them to look closely at exactly what they were preserving, because the contents of this desert library would turn out to be even more remarkable than the strange circumstances of its creation. By the time the storm finally arrived, the Qumran community had produced, or collected, what may be the single most important library of the ancient Jewish world. Though, of course, none of them thought of it in such grand terms. To them, it was simply their sacred literature, gathered and copied because it mattered, because it was true, because it needed to survive. Roughly 900 separate scrolls or scroll fragments would eventually be recovered from the 11 caves surrounding Qumran. Some caves yielding only a handful of fragments, others like Cave 4, yielding literally tens of thousands of pieces, a shattered jigsaw puzzle of ancient parchment that scholars are, in some sense, still piecing together today. Roughly a quarter of these scrolls are copies of books that would later become part of the Hebrew Bible. Nearly every book of what Christians call the Old Testament is represented, in whole or in fragment, with the notable exception of the Book of Esther. Some of these copies are startling in their age. The great Isaiah scroll, found in Cave 1 by the shepherd boy himself, was copied around a century or more before the birth of Jesus, making it roughly 1,000 years older than any previously known complete copy of that biblical book. When scholars compared it, letter by letter, to the medieval Hebrew texts that had formed the basis of biblical translation for centuries, they found something remarkable: overwhelming consistency. Across 1,000 years of copying and recopying by hand, the core text had been preserved with extraordinary, almost startling accuracy, a testament to the discipline of generations of scribes who came both before and after the Qumran community, all bound by the same reverence for precision. But biblical texts were only part of the library. Another substantial portion consisted of works modern scholars call apocryphal or pseudepigraphal, religious writings that were read, valued, and sometimes considered scripture by various Jewish communities of the period, but which did not ultimately make it into the standardized Hebrew Bible. Books like Enoch, Jubilees, and Tobit appear among the scrolls, offering historians a broader, richer picture of the diversity of Jewish religious thought before certain texts were formally selected and others set aside, a process of selection that had not yet fully hardened into fixed doctrine during the period these scrolls were written. And then there are what scholars call the sectarian texts, documents written by the Qumran community itself, describing its own beliefs, laws, and expectations. The community rule, sometimes called the Manual of Discipline, lays out in careful detail the community structure, its process for admitting new members, its punishments for infractions. We learn from this document that a member who fell asleep during a communal meeting could be punished with reduced rations for 10 days. We learn that speaking out of turn, interrupting a senior member, could bring a penalty of 30 days. We learn that a man who spat in the middle of an assembly, a small, almost comically human detail, could be disciplined for 30 days as well, the same penalty as interrupting an elder, suggesting a community deeply concerned with maintaining dignity and order in every physical gesture, not merely in matters of doctrine. There are hymns of astonishing personal intensity, collected in a document called the Thanksgiving Hymns, written in the first person, expressing gratitude, anguish, and a profound sense of chosenness. Verses that read, in translation, less like formal liturgy and more like the private diary of someone convinced they had been rescued from despair by divine mercy. There are also texts concerned with the calculation of time itself, calendars mapping out the correct dates for festivals according to the community's distinctive solar system. priestly rotations extending years into the future, astronomical calculations attempting to align earthly observance with what they believed was heaven's own unchanging rhythm. And scattered among all of this, small human traces survive that have nothing to do with grand theology at all. Fragments of what appear to be personal letters, records of property, a tiny scrap referencing a marriage contract. These are the kinds of documents that remind us the people at Qumran were not abstractions, not simply representatives of a religious movement, but individuals who married, owned small possessions, argued over property, worried about mundane things even while awaiting the end of the world. Taken together, this library represents something historians had never possessed before its discovery, an unfiltered, unmediated window into Jewish religious life and thought in the exact period when both later Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity were taking shape. Before the scrolls were found, our knowledge of this era came largely through later texts, filtered through centuries of subsequent editing, translation, and theological interpretation. Suddenly, scholars possessed original document from the actual moment, buried and untouched, offering a raw, unedited glimpse into ideas, debates, and daily concerns that had otherwise vanished from history entirely. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of treasure worth protecting at any cost. And soon, the community would need to protect it, because the storm they had long anticipated, the great and final confrontation they believed history itself was building toward, was no longer a matter of prophecy. It was marching toward them in the form of Roman legions, and it would arrive far sooner and far more literally than any of them had imagined. In the year 66 of the Common Era, Judea rose in open revolt against Rome. The uprising did not begin at Qumran. It began, as these things often do, far away and seemingly unrelated, in Caesarea, in disputes over taxation, in a long accumulation of resentments that finally broke into violence. But rebellion, once it starts, does not stay contained to its point of origin. It spread across the province like fire through dry grass, and within months, Judea stood in open-armed defiance of the most powerful military machine in the ancient world. Rome's response was neither swift nor merciful, but it was, in the end, absolutely certain. The empire dispatched a seasoned general named Vespasian, along with his son Titus, at the head of a force numbering in the tens of thousands, equipped with the discipline, engineering, and sheer patience that had made Roman military campaigns so devastatingly effective for centuries. Roman legions did not simply attack. They besieged. They built siege walls, encircling towns completely, cutting off food and water, starving resistance into submission with methodical, almost bureaucratic cruelty before ever storming a single gate. For the Qumran community, tucked into the desert cliffs above the Dead Sea, the war did not arrive as a single dramatic battle. It arrived as a slow tightening of the world around them. News traveling slowly across the wilderness, rumors of towns burned, of populations enslaved or slaughtered, of Jerusalem itself, the sacred center of their entire religious universe, drawn into a siege that would culminate in the year 70 in catastrophe. The temple, expanded so magnificently by Herod, the same temple whose corruption had originally driven the teacher of righteousness into exile generations before, was burned to the ground by Roman soldiers, its enormous stones toppled and scattered, fulfilling, in the eyes of many later Jewish writers, prophecies of destruction almost too painful to fully absorb. Archaeological evidence suggests Roman forces reached Qumran itself around the year 68, roughly midway through the broader war. We do not have a first-person account of what happened in those final days of the settlement. No scroll describing the community's last hours. What we have instead is the physical evidence left behind, and it tells a story of hurried, desperate preparation. Picture the scene as best the evidence allows us to reconstruct it. Word arrives, perhaps from a fleeing traveler, perhaps from smoke visible on the horizon, that Roman soldiers are advancing toward the Dead Sea. There is no time for careful deliberation, no time for a formal community meeting with its usual rules about who may speak and in what order. There is only the desperate, practical question: what do we save and how? The scrolls, the community's entire library, its life's work, could not be carried to safety across open desert while being pursued by an army. They could, however, be hidden, and the same cliffs that had sheltered the community for generations offered an obvious answer. Members likely worked quickly, wrapping precious scrolls in linen cloth, sealing them inside tall clay jars specifically designed to protect fragile materials from moisture and vermin, and carrying these jars into the deep, dry recesses of the surrounding caves, some requiring difficult, even dangerous climbs to reach. This was not a casual decision to tidy away a library. This was an act of desperate faith, the belief, even in a moment of existential crisis, that these words mattered more than any individual life, that someone someday might need them, even if the community itself did not survive to retrieve them. They did not survive to retrieve them. Archaeological excavation of the Qumran settlement itself reveals signs consistent with violent destruction around this period. Burned layers, damaged structures, arrowheads embedded in walls, and a scattering of Roman coins from the years of the revolt found among the ruins, marking, with grim precision, roughly when the end came. Whether the community's members were killed on site, scattered into the wider countryside, or absorbed into the general chaos and displacement of the wider war, we simply do not know. No later document claims to speak for a Qumran survivor. No return is recorded. No community reclaimed its hidden treasure. The silence itself is its own kind of evidence. Rome's brutality toward the Jewish rebellion did not end with the fall of Jerusalem in 70. Pockets of resistance continued for years afterward, most famously at the fortress of Masada, not far south along the same Dead Sea coastline, where, according to the historian Josephus, the last defenders chose death by their own hand rather than capture, in the spring of the year 73 or 74. Whether every detail of that account is precisely accurate remains debated among historians, but the broader truth it represents is not in doubt. This was a war of near-total devastation for Jewish Judea, reshaping the entire religious and political landscape of the region for centuries to come. And somewhere in the quiet aftermath of all this fire and loss, 11 caves along a stretch of desert cliffs sat sealed, undisturbed, their contents settling slowly into the dry, changeless air. The world outside would transform beyond all recognition. Empires would rise and fall. New religions would emerge, spread, and reshape entire continents. And still, inside those clay jars, wrapped in their disintegrating linen, the words of the teacher of righteousness and his followers waited, patient in a way no living person can truly be, for a return that would not come for nearly 2,000 years. Silence is easy to describe and difficult to imagine. 2,000 years is a span almost too large for the human mind to hold in any real, felt way. It helps, perhaps, to walk through it in pieces, to imagine what passed above those sealed caves, while the scrolls themselves remained motionless in darkness, untouched, unread, entirely unaware of their own suspension in time. In the decades immediately following the destruction of Qumran, the wider Jewish world reorganized itself around new centers of authority, particularly in Galilee and eventually in Babylon, as rabbis worked to preserve Jewish law and tradition without a temple at its center. The specific form of Judaism practiced at Qumran, with its distinct calendar, its rigid communal structure, its expectation of imminent apocalyptic war, found no continuation. It simply ended, its last practitioners scattered or killed, its unique perspective preserved nowhere except, unknowingly, in those hidden jars. Meanwhile, a new religious movement, born from the same soil, the same language, the same scriptural tradition, began to spread outward from Judea into the wider Mediterranean world. Early Christianity, with its own sense of urgent expectation, its own communal meals, its own emphasis on purity and chosenness, would eventually become one of the dominant religious forces in human history. And scholars have long noted intriguing points of resemblance between early Christian practice and the practices described in the Qumran scrolls, though the precise nature of any connection remains debated, without clear evidence of direct contact between the two movements. Centuries passed above the silent caves. The Roman Empire that had crushed the Jewish revolt would itself eventually fracture and decline. A new religion, Islam, would emerge from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century, sweeping across the Middle East with extraordinary speed, and the Dead Sea region would pass under a new set of rulers, a new dominant language, a new religious framework entirely. Remarkably, we know that at least once during these long centuries, someone did stumble upon at least some of the hidden scrolls, long before the shepherd boy of 1947. A letter written around the year 800 by a Christian church leader named Timothy I, the patriarch of the Church of the East, describes hearing of a cave near Jericho where a hunter, chasing a dog into a rock crevice, had discovered numerous ancient books written in Hebrew. Timothy's account, remarkably specific, mentions that both Jewish and Christian scholars traveled to investigate the find, and then the trail simply vanishes. No further record survives of what became of those particular scrolls, whether they were lost, dispersed, or destroyed. It is a haunting historical footnote, proof that Qumran's secret nearly surfaced more than 1,000 years earlier than it finally did, only to slip back into darkness almost immediately. The centuries continued their slow accumulation. Crusader armies marched through this landscape in the medieval period, building and losing fortresses along routes not far from the silent cliffs. Ottoman administrators governed a region for 400 years, from the 16th century into the 20th, treating the Dead Sea's western shore as a remote, unremarkable corner of a vast empire, of little apparent interest beyond its unusual salt-heavy water. Occasionally visited by curious European travelers who wrote home describing the strange, buoyant sea and the desolate, beautiful hills surrounding it. Through all of this, the rise and fall of caliphates, the passage of pilgrims and merchants and armies, the slow turning of 2,000 years of human history, the jars in the caves remained precisely where desperate hands had placed them, protected paradoxically by the very harshness of the environment that had made Qumran such an unlikely place to build a community in the first place. The extreme dryness of the Judean desert, the stable temperature within the caves, the near total absence of moisture that might otherwise have caused organic material to rot. All of it worked, unintentionally, in the scroll's favor. Had this same library been buried almost anywhere else in the Mediterranean world, it likely would have disintegrated into dust within a few centuries. Here, in one of the most inhospitable landscapes on the planet, aridity became preservation. Hostility became protection. By the early 20th century, the world above those caves had transformed beyond anything the Qumran community could have imagined. The land had passed from Ottoman control into a British-administered mandate following the First World War. Motor cars had replaced camel caravans on distant roads. Telegraph wires and eventually radio signals crossed distances that once took weeks to traverse. And still, within the caves, nothing had changed at all. The clay jar sat in the same undisturbed dust, the linen wrapping slowly, imperceptibly weakening, the ink on the parchment inside remaining exactly as dark and legible as the day some anxious scribe, working quickly under the shadow of an approaching army, had sealed the lid one final time. It would take one more ordinary afternoon, one more wandering goat, to finally break that silence. And what followed would prove almost as dramatic, in its own quieter way, as the ancient catastrophe that had buried the scrolls in the first place. News of the shepherd boy's discovery moved slowly at first, exactly the way it had moved slowly for Timothy the Patriarch's cave centuries earlier, passed hand to hand through a network of dealers, monks, and cautious intermediaries rather than broadcast instantly to the world. The antiquities dealer Cando in Bethlehem eventually connected with a Syrian Orthodox archbishop named Mar Athanasius Yesu Samuel, who purchased several of the scrolls in 1947, reportedly for a sum equivalent to a modest sum in American dollars, a price that, in hindsight, stands as one of history's great historical bargains, given what those same scrolls would eventually be valued at. Around the same time, other scrolls from the same cave made their way to Professor Eliezer Sukenik of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a scholar of Jewish archaeology who recognized, almost immediately, the extraordinary antiquity of the script before him. Sukenik's own account of first encountering the scrolls carries genuine emotional weight. He described handling the ancient parchment with something close to reverence, aware even in that first moment that he was looking at something far older than almost anything previously available to scholars of the Hebrew Bible. It is worth remembering that this recognition occurred in November of 1947, in the same tense weeks that the United Nations was voting on the partition of Palestine, in a region already sliding toward the war that would accompany the founding of the State of Israel the following year. Scholarship and history were quite literally colliding in real time. Archbishop Samuel, for his part, eventually brought his scrolls to the United States, and in 1954, in an episode almost too strange for fiction, placed an advertisement in the classified section of the Wall Street Journal, offering 4 ancient biblical manuscripts for sale, described only generally, without academic fanfare, essentially as one might advertise a used car. The advertisement was seen and acted upon by Sukenik's own son, Yigal Yadin, himself a noted archaeologist and former military commander, who arranged, through intermediaries, to purchase the scrolls and return them to Israel, reuniting them with the fragments his father had acquired years before. Meanwhile, word of the discovery had reached the wider archaeological and academic community, and in the years following 1947, a coordinated search began of the cliffs surrounding Qumran, undertaken partly by scholars and partly, more chaotically, by local Bedouin who quickly recognized that these strange old skins commanded real money on the antiquities market. This created an odd, uneasy partnership and rivalry. Professional archaeologists racing against local treasure hunters to locate the remaining caves before their contents were looted, damaged, or dispersed onto the black market before proper study could occur. Between 1947 and 1956, 10 additional caves were discovered along the cliffs near Qumran, most prolific among them Cave 4, located almost directly beneath the ruins of the settlement itself, which alone yielded tens of thousands of fragments, a staggering, overwhelming mass of broken parchment that would occupy scholars for decades simply attempting to sort, identify, and reassemble. The early international team assembled to study these fragments, working from a shared office space that came to be known, with a certain dark irony, as the scrollery in Jerusalem was small and drawn largely from a narrow circle of Western institutions. This arrangement, while producing genuine scholarly achievement, also planted the seeds of later controversy. For decades, access to unpublished scroll fragments remained tightly restricted to this small circle, frustrating outside scholars and fueling increasingly elaborate theories about what secrets the unpublished material might contain, theories that flourished, as such theories tend to, precisely because the primary evidence remained locked away from independent verification. It would not be until 1991, more than 4 decades after the initial discovery, that this restrictive access finally broke open, following a combination of pressure from outside scholars, the unauthorized release of a computer-reconstructed concordance of scroll vocabulary, and finally the publication of a complete set of photographic plates by an American research institution, effectively making the full scroll collection available for study by any qualified scholar, regardless of their standing within the original research team. The scholarly world, quite suddenly, found itself with far more material to study than it had previously been permitted to see and perhaps just as importantly, no more excuse for secrecy. It is worth pausing on this particular human drama because it complicates any simple, triumphant narrative of discovery. The scrolls were not merely found and celebrated. They were fought over by nations, by institutions, by individual scholars protective of their own specialized authority. Political tensions in the region added further layers of complexity. Ownership and access to some of the scrolls became entangled in the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict, given that the original caves lie in territory whose sovereignty remains disputed, a tension that persists in various forms into the present day. And through all of this, the purchases, the classified advertisements, the restricted access, the eventual opening of the archive to the wider world, the actual content of the scrolls continued to reshape entire fields of study. Biblical scholars gained access to Hebrew texts 1,000 years older than anything previously available. Historians of religion gained an unprecedented window into the diversity and complexity of Jewish thought in the era immediately surrounding the birth of Christianity. And ordinary readers, following the story through newspapers and later documentaries, found themselves captivated by something rare, an ancient mystery that kept producing new answers decade after decade, each one raising fresh questions in turn. The shepherd boy could never have imagined any of this, standing at the mouth of that cave in 1947, listening to the sound of a shard of pottery breaking somewhere in the darkness below him. He had reached, without knowing it, into one of the most carefully guarded secrets of the ancient world, a secret that would take the rest of the 20th century and stretch into the 21st, simply to begin fully understanding. Today, the scrolls no longer sit in darkness. They rest, instead, under carefully controlled light, in climate-regulated cases designed to halt the very decay the desert once so improbably prevented on its own. The most celebrated of them are housed at the Shrine of the Book, a museum in Jerusalem built specifically to display them. Its architecture deliberately unusual, a white dome modeled on the lids of the very clay jars in which the scrolls were originally found, set against a black basalt wall. A visual echo of the ancient conflict between light and darkness that runs through so much of the sectarian writing recovered from the caves. Visitors walk toward the great Isaiah scroll, or careful facsimiles of it, along a path designed to evoke the darkness of the cave itself, before opening into the bright chamber where the text is displayed. The building itself, in other words, has become a kind of narrative echoing the very story we have been telling. But the scroll's influence extends far beyond any single museum. For biblical scholars, the discovery permanently altered the study of scriptural transmission. Before Qumran, the oldest complete Hebrew biblical manuscripts available dated to the medieval period, roughly 1,000 years after the time of Jesus. Scholars had long wondered how faithfully those medieval texts preserved far older originals. The scrolls answered that question with remarkable clarity, overwhelmingly faithfully in most respects, though with enough small variations, additions, and alternate readings to reveal that the biblical text in this earlier period was somewhat more fluid, more actively still taking its final shape than later tradition would ever have suggested. This was not a discovery that shattered faith or scholarship. It was one that deepened both, adding nuance and historical texture to a text long treated as static. For historians of religion, the sectarian scrolls opened an entirely new window onto the diversity of Jewish thought in the centuries surrounding the birth of Christianity, revealing a religious world far less monolithic, far more experimental and varied than later, more standardized traditions might suggest. Concepts of messianic expectation, ritual purity, communal living, and apocalyptic urgency, once known to modern readers primarily through later Christian sources, suddenly appeared in their older, distinctly Jewish context, complicating and enriching our understanding of how these two great religious traditions related to one another in their earliest, most fluid years. And for ordinary readers, people with no particular scholarly training at all, the scrolls have remained, for more than 70 years now, a source of genuine, almost startling wonder. Proof that history is not always a closed book, that entire libraries can still wait patiently to be found, that a single wandering goat and one curious teenager can alter the landscape of human knowledge in an afternoon. Modern technology continues to extract new secrets from even the most damaged fragments. Multispectral imaging, developed originally for entirely different scientific purposes, has allowed researchers to read text on scroll fragments so blackened and charred that the words are utterly invisible to the naked eye, revealing lines of ancient Hebrew that no human eye has read since the scribe who first wrote them 2,000 years before. Even now, in laboratories far from that desert cliffside, small fragments continue to yield new readings, new connections, new pieces of a puzzle that may never be entirely complete. Because that perhaps is the truest legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not a finished story, but an ongoing one. A community that believed itself abandoned by history, exiled into the wilderness, ended up doing something no army, no empire, no passing century could undo. They preserved a fragment of truth so carefully that it outlasted everyone who ever doubted it would matter. The stone is warm, even in shadow. Picture the boy again, Muhammad Edib, standing at the mouth of that cave in the spring of 1947, listening to the sound of something breaking in the darkness below. He does not know what he has found. He knows only that a goat has wandered off, and that a strange, dull crack has interrupted an otherwise ordinary afternoon in the hills above the Dead Sea. We know now what he could not have known then. We know that the sound he heard was pottery 2,000 years old, cracking in air it had not touched since a desperate community sealed it shut, fleeing an army they could not outrun. We know that inside those jars lay the accumulated devotion of men who believed the world was ending, men who copied scripture by lamplight, argued over calendars, disciplined each other for laughing at the wrong moment, and waited with total conviction for a battle between light and darkness that never arrived in the form they expected. We know that their true battle was quieter than the one they imagined. It was fought not with trumpets and battle lines, but with reed pens and scraped parchment, against the oldest enemy of all, forgetting. They won that battle. 2,000 years of silence did not erase them. It preserved them. The boy climbs back down toward his scattered goats, a few brittle scrolls tucked under his arm. Worth, he imagines, a few coins in a Bethlehem market. He has no way of knowing he is the last link in a chain begun by frightened hands in the year 68. Hands that wrapped linen around parchment, sealed the jar, and trusted the dark and the silence to keep faith until someone, someday, came looking. Someone finally did. And the desert, patient as ever, let go of what it had been asked to hold.